Hello, this is Lady Boulay, and I hope you are having a most wonderful day. Thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. Thank you for your thumbs up, for your comments, and thank you for sharing the videos. Thank you for all you do to support the channel. Well, this is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s weekend. This is the weekend that we celebrate his birthday and his accomplishments in America. Dr. Martin Luther King is one of the greatest Black American icons, and many of us who were alive during the time that he was alive appreciate what he did, because we know what America was like before Dr. King's sacrifice, his martyrdom, because he was martyred at Memphis. But a lot of people don't seem to know what a lot of people don't know what America was like before the sacrifice. But he gave it all. But my question is, was it worth it? Well, for me and people like me, it was worth it. Dr. King was not perfect. His movement was not perfect. But America was also not perfect. And it definitely was not perfect for Black people. I want to talk about Dr. King's greatest accomplishments, because talk is very cheap. That's what we say on this channel. Talk is very cheap. But when you put your life on the line because you believe a change needs to be made, that life deserves to be examined. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15th, 1929, to Martin Luther King Sr., a Baptist minister, and Alberta Williams King. Dr. Martin Luther King's mother was the church organist at Ebenezer Baptist Church, which was Dr. King's home church. And she was assassinated at church in 1974. So this family really suffered and sacrificed for what they believed in. Dr. King had one brother, A.D. King, and one sister, Christine King Ferris. His brother has passed, but Christine Ferris is still alive, and she's 95 years old. Dr. King received his education in Atlanta Public Schools. He earned his B.S. degree from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, after which he earned a B.S. degree in divinity from Crozer Theological Seminary in Upland, Pennsylvania. From there, he enrolled in Boston University, where he earned a Ph.D. degree in systematic theology. Dr. Martin Luther King had a Ph.D. degree. He could have taken that degree and done what a lot of Black American scholars do, go to some big Ivy League school, because they pay for Black brains. If you have brains and a fascination for money and white women and the fellowship of white people, and you will teach and behave the way they want you to teach and behave, they will give you big money to take you out of circulation so you won't have any influence on Black people. I'm sure Dr. King was tempted to take a position at a big university or corporation, but he was a Southern preacher, and he returned to the South and took a position as the pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And it was in Montgomery that his notoriety began. He spearheaded the Montgomery bus boycott, which fascinated the whole country and world, really. And from there, Dr. King's name was on the map. He built a great following, and he had great influence in the United States because he had conviction and because he was well-spoken and he was charismatic. People were captivated by his speech, and even now, when you listen to him speak, he had a very unique style of speaking that is actually mesmerizing. In Montgomery, he participated in and led marches for the right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other civil rights. Dr. King's marches were done through nonviolent means. They called it nonviolent resistance. Dr. King galvanized Black people in the South. He had a lot of supporters. There were a lot of Black people who were against what he was doing, but he had a large following. They used to have mass meetings in the South, which was like a big rally, but they would talk about the struggle. They would talk about the things that they were fighting for, but they would also talk about how you have to resist when the police come upon you, putting dogs on you, tear gas, water hose, whatever, you had to resist, because if you didn't resist, that was just going to be open season on the marchers. The Montgomery bus boycott was very successful, and then Dr. King led other marches throughout the South where he brought attention to the dire conditions of black people in America. The civil rights movement in America was televised. It was on television, in the newspapers, on the radio. People were talking about Martin Luther King. Everything Dr. King did was announced to the nation. It brought consciousness to what was happening to black Americans. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King won the Nobel Peace Prize for his nonviolent resistance to racial discrimination. Dr. King began talking with President John F. Kennedy about a civil rights bill, a bill that would grant black Americans full rights as American citizens. President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and President Johnson became President of the United States. And he took up where President Kennedy left off. And it was through President Johnson that the Civil Rights Bill was passed. But Dr. King had been networking with those presidents to get that bill passed. And I'm going to say he was a champion for his own people, even though now everybody is trying to claim him. But he was a spokesperson for black American descendants of slavery. In this modern age, it is common now for African Americans, especially those who were not alive when Dr. King was assassinated, to question his relevancy. What was it for? Or he just died so black men could marry white women. That is not true. The Loving versus Virginia case made it so black men could marry white women. There is no legislation, no speech, no anything that Dr. King was involved in that said anything about black men marrying white women or black women marrying white men. Loving versus Virginia took care of that. In Dr. King's speech, I Have a Dream, he did talk about boys and girls playing together or something like that, but he was talking about going to school together, and he did address racial discrimination in education, the disparities in education. That wasn't really his advocacy, because Brown versus Board of Education addressed racial discrimination in American public schools. Dr. King did advocate for integration, but I think even before he passed, he realized that he was advocating for the wrong thing. But he never advocated for interracial marriage. Or if he did, I want somebody to show that to me in writing. Interestingly enough, there are a lot of black people in modern times who have decided that Dr. Martin Luther King really didn't accomplish anything, that he set black people back. He did more harm than he did good. They have decided that based on we haven't made any progress since Dr. Martin Luther King died. Dr. Martin Luther King has been dead for 54 years. That job has been vacant for that long. So anybody who thought there was something that needed to be done that he didn't do has had every opportunity to do it. Dr. King had some great accomplishments, but his greatest accomplishments were getting legislation passed. This marching around and singing and we shall overcome and all of that, that's fine if that's what somebody wants to do. But if it doesn't result in legislation, which will result in change, it really doesn't do very much for black Americans. Dr. King, through his advocacy and his ability to influence presidents, was able to get legislation passed that changed the lives of black Americans and anybody in America who was not a white American forever. And that's his greatest accomplishment. And I think a lot of people don't realize that the things that we take for granted every day are possible because of the efforts of Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. Martin Luther King was instrumental in getting the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 passed. And he did that by working with two American presidents, President John F. Kennedy and President Lyndon B. Johnson. Now, first and foremost, everybody doesn't get to meet with presidents. So you have to have some credibility, especially back in 1960 and 62 and 63 and 64. You had to have some credibility as a white person before you would get to that Oval Office. And you definitely had to have some influence and some credibility as a black person to get in the Oval Office for a president to talk to you in the first place. Many people really don't know what the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 did, not only for black Americans, but for anybody that is not identified as a white American. Everybody who is not a white American has benefited from the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I want to go over the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 because these things have been instrumental in transforming America into the place where everybody wants to come to, where everybody thinks that America was tailor-made just for them. Well, you can reference that back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, the caution to black Americans is that because our struggle, our civil rights movement, our leaders push this legislation through, what America has done on the back end is got the word out to the immigrants that are coming to America is that they have to develop an anti-black American attitude, which is what we see. We know that. That's why we say we don't have any friends, whether they're from Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, South America. We really don't have any friends, but that's a part of it. That's the payoff for them and the payback to us for pushing that legislation through. So the irony is that our effort is what gave them access to America and its civil rights laws, and they turn on us. Go figure. So let's look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Let's look at what it does and why it is so important to every non-white person in the United States. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a landmark civil rights and labor law in the United States that outlaws discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. It prohibits unequal application of voter registration requirements, racial segregation in schools, and public accommodations and employment discrimination. The Act remains one of the most significant legislative achievements in American history, and that is absolutely the truth. Matter of fact, I would say it is the most significant legislative achievement. Now, those just might sound like pretty words, but it's more than pretty words. Let's break it down. This law outlaws discrimination based on race, and we're just going to focus on race. Black people were discriminated against based on race in every aspect of American life. There is nothing that you could name before 1964 that black people were not discriminated against. And so was all these other people that were here. They just weren't saying anything. Plus, they weren't even letting that many people in. And they definitely weren't letting a whole lot of people of color into this country, which is why it's so baffling to see how Africans behave when they come here. They definitely weren't letting any Africans in here. But this constitutional law says you cannot discriminate against people because of their race. We have this influx of Muslims. We never heard about a whole lot of Muslims in the United States before 1964. Brown and in between brown and white and just all of these people coming in here and taking it for granted. But who's taking it for granted the most are black Americans. Before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, black Americans weren't voting. They weren't voting in big numbers, and if you did, what it said was unequal application of voter registration requirements, which meant that black people had to go through some kind of stringent test in order to be able to vote, asking you how many jelly beans were in a jar and how many grains of rice was in a pack of rice. Stupid stuff. That's what they were requiring black people to do. You had to be a landowner. You had to have money in the bank. Just anything that they could come up with to prevent you from voting, they would do it. The Civil Rights Act said that's against the law. It also says that you cannot discriminate against people based on employment. There were jobs that black people couldn't even apply for before the Civil Rights Act. And everybody knows that. Well, the new generation of black people probably doesn't know that. But you couldn't just go and apply for a job at the dollar store. Black people weren't cashiers at the dollar store. You could clean it up. Couldn't even be a teller in a bank. You could clean it up. You could go to a restaurant and sit down and eat a meal, or go to the bathroom, or go to a hotel and register for a hotel. That's how come they had the Green Book. That's what the Green Book was all about. So black people who were traveling across the country could find places of accommodation where they could get something to eat and spend the night and use the bathroom. Our top entertainers like Lena Horne, Della Reese, Sammy Davis Jr., Duke Ellington, Ella Fitzgerald, Sarah Vaughan, Harry Belafonte, they would be employed at a hotel to work the ballroom. They could go in that ballroom, entertain those white people, and they had to leave that hotel. They could not stay at the hotel. They could not eat at the hotel. They could not use the bathroom. When they finished their act, they had to get the hell out of there. And there was no such thing as light skin privilege. If you were a Negro, you were going to stay in a Negro's place. We could not attend these big colleges and universities, all of which our enslaved ancestors built and paid for. People from all over the world, from Asia, from Europe, from South America, as long as they were white, and some of them might not be so white, but they couldn't be black. We could not attend these colleges. We had to go to historically black colleges. If you graduated from college with a BS degree, because none of them had master's degrees in those days, you had to go out of state to University of Iowa, University of Michigan, University of Illinois, somewhere like that. You had to go. The state of Alabama and all of these southern states paid for you to go to college up north or out west or wherever they would accept you. Rather than let you go to school in state, they paid for you to earn degrees of higher education outside the South. And also, the K through 12 public education was segregated, and there was educational disparity in funding, in resources, even in teaching staff. We got the bottom of everything in our schools, especially in the South. We never got new desks. We got desks that came from the white school where they had written up the desks and had all kind of racial slurs on the desks. We got used books, same thing. They had written up all those racial slurs all over the books. They were nasty. It was Jim Crow America, also known as the second slavery. The American society was shut down for black Americans, and it really only changed 58 years ago. It was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that opened up the American society for black Americans, and black people really need to know this. There was almost nothing that you could do in the United States that you can do now. You could do menial labor. You could go to some kind of segregated area and do whatever and work or go to school. We had segregated schools because even though Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed racial segregation in public schools, was passed in 1954, that law was not enforced until the 1964 Civil Rights Bill was passed. That is a very inclusive bill. I cannot go into every aspect of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 in a short video, but it was all inclusive and it changed the lives of black Americans forever. And then there was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, of which Dr. King also orchestrated. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed into law on August the 6th of 1965, also by President Lyndon B. Johnson, and it prohibits racial discrimination in voting. Now, why did they need the additional Voting Rights Act? Because the Civil Rights Bill prohibited discrimination in voting, because they were still doing trickery, voter suppression, and gerrymandering, stuff that they're still doing right now. Black people started really voting in large numbers after 1965. Now again, we have black people complaining about voting and you shouldn't vote and you shouldn't vote because the Democrats want you to do this. Well, we only have two political parties in the United States that are really viable. and that's the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So you're going to vote for one of them. Now, you can not vote. I mean, nobody forces anybody to vote. But here's the thing. Everybody else is going to vote. So if black people couldn't vote, then that would just be something else to complain about. So the thing about it is, if you don't want to vote, don't vote. Nobody died to force you to vote. Lives were sacrificed so we would have the right to vote. You have the right to vote, but you have to make that decision. But what I really want black Americans to know is that during the civil rights movement, black people had to risk their lives, their livelihood, their homes. They were killed. They were tear gassed. They were beat by the police. Dogs were sicked on them. Every kind of humiliation that could be done was done to them. But they stood up and they stood it because they wanted change. And they were willing to put everything on the line for that change. Dr. Martin Luther King gave it all. He sacrificed it all. And I feel like it was worth it. But that's a question that every black person has to ask themselves. Was what he did worth it? I believe that it was. And I also want black Americans to know, when you're talking about that every non-white person in the United States of America benefited from two things. Well, actually three pieces of legislation. The 14th Amendment, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those bills were passed because of the efforts of black people, but they included everybody. And that's how come we say these other people are over here on our dime, because our people were sacrificed. They suffered. And Dr. King was not the only one that died for this legislation and for this society to be opened up. And that is why you shouldn't back down from anybody. Black Americans shouldn't back down from anybody. Nobody else was willing to put their lives on the line. Nobody else had the credibility Dr. Martin Luther King had. And nobody has had the credibility that Dr. Martin Luther King has had since. And that includes Barack Obama. Barack Obama got where he is because what Dr. King had done before he even got here. And people can talk about him having affairs or him doing this, that, or whatever else they want to talk about. Nobody was able to do for black Americans what Dr. Martin Luther King was able to do. But I want to emphasize before I end this video, Dr. Martin Luther King did not die so black people could marry white people. That's what Loving versus Virginia did. Dr. Martin Luther King put his life on the line to open up the American society so black people would have a chance to live decent lives as American citizens. And everybody has benefited from it. Everybody coming to this country has benefited from it, because you didn't see anybody in this country doing the things that you see them doing now. For all of the talk about the model minority Asians, you didn't see Asians participating in American life like you do now. Pretty much what Asians were doing was cooking rice and ironing shirts. They were not TV anchors. They were not in the halls of Congress. They were not doing the things that they're doing now. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says you cannot discriminate against anybody based on race, color, nationality, religion, or sex. And so that included everybody. And that's when the Asians entered into American life. There was discrimination everywhere you went, and it was all over this country. I know people like to say it was in the South. It was all over this country. Discrimination happened against black people all over this country. But if it had not been for the commitment, the courage, the charisma, and the intelligence of Dr. Martin Luther King, and the fortitude and the courage of black Americans, America would not be what it is today, and black people would not be where we are today. So on Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, I say happy birthday to you. Thank you. Your sacrifice was great, but it's been a blessing to the world. Thank you for listening. Subscribe to the channel, give me a thumbs up, leave a comment, share the video, and as always, have a great day.